Hey guys, today we are digging deep, literally and figuratively, into a question your ancestors lost sleep over: how do you keep meat from rotting when refrigerators won't exist for another 600 years? Welcome to a world where dinner can't be frozen, meat goes sour in hours, and the smell alone could earn a village dog sainthood for loyalty. Today, we will walk through medieval kitchens, smoky barns, and underground cellars to understand just how creative, and occasionally terrifying, our forebears got when trying to avoid food poisoning. You will taste salt on your lips, feel the heat of open fire, and maybe gag once or twice. You probably won't survive this, but if you do, you will never look at a ham the same way again. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It begins, as all desperate innovation does, with a dead animal and a ticking clock. A boar's been brought down in the woods, or a cow has reached the end of its usefulness. The meat must be eaten, or saved, before decay sets in. Enter salt. Not the sprinkle you toss on fries, but pounds of it, hauled in sacks from coastal flats or imported at ruinous cost. Meat is rubbed, packed, and layered in salt like treasure in gritty snow. It draws out moisture, the lifeblood of bacteria, and transforms fresh muscle into dense, chewy slabs tough enough to survive weeks on the road or months in a larder. Smoking is salt's smoky sibling. You hang your cuts, bacon, hams, sausages, above a smoldering fire in a low-roofed smokehouse. The wood must be carefully chosen: oak for bite, applewood for sweetness, juniper for mystery. It is not just the heat or dryness that helps preserve the meat. It is the phenols and aldehydes in the smoke that turn flesh into jerky like armor. And it is a slow dance, days or weeks depending on cut, climate, and hunger. Some villages built permanent smoke sheds, blackened from generations of dripping fat and clinging ash. In 13th century England, laws regulated smoked goods sold at market. If your bacon smelled off or your fish too faint, a town official, often literally called a taste tester, could fine you for fraud. But here's a quirk: in colder northern climes, people sometimes buried meat in snow or froze it in animal skins. It worked, until a sudden thaw turned your emergency roast into swamp. More fringe still, some chronicles mention burying salted meat in barrels coated with pitch, to be opened only in crisis or war. A medieval MRE, if you will. Historians still argue whether ordinary peasants had consistent access to these methods or whether meat preservation was a luxury of monasteries, castles, and well-staffed kitchens. Many say the average villager simply boiled meat often, stretching its edibility by sheer repetition. Others insist every hamlet had a trick, a pit here, a smoke shelf there, a superstition everywhere. And the fear was constant. Bad meat did not just taste foul, it killed. Or at the very least, ruined your week. So, they learned to listen to the hiss of salt on raw flesh, to smell when smoke had set, and to trust the gray shimmer of good fat turned stiff with preservation. Because meat meant power. Meat meant survival. And without a fridge, the battle started with salt, smoke, and desperation. Step down into the earth. No, really, because after salt and smoke, the next defense in the medieval preservation arsenal is the ground itself. Cellars, pits, caves. Anything that stays cool, damp, and dark becomes a sacred space in the war against spoilage. And in a world without electricity, temperature control is less about dials and more about geography and luck. You are standing now in a manor cellar, your breath misting as you duck beneath low arches of stone. The floor is packed earth. The air smells of must and meat, of straw and faint mildew. Against one wall, butchered pork hangs from iron hooks, crusted in salt. Beside it, a wicker basket of smoked eels glistens like leather. Everything is still. The meat is not frozen, but it is not rotting either. Not yet. Above ground, in colder months, meat might be strung beneath rafters or between beams in barn lofts, exposed to biting winter air and far from ground pests. Some clever households even hung salted birds from tree branches, trusting wind and frost to keep them edible. Cold smoking in open air was part art, part guesswork, and sometimes part prayer. In parts of Germany and Scandinavia, entire rooms were built just for hanging meat near chimney vents, called rochkammern, or smoke chambers. They were not always sealed off from living quarters, meaning your home might smell like smoked goose year-round, arguably an upgrade. And then there are meat safes, wooden cabinets punched with holes and covered in fine mesh or linen. These are the medieval cousin of the screen door fridge. Hang your sausages, prop open the windows, and let the breeze do the rest. On feast days, you might see dozens of such cabinets pulled out into shaded courtyards, their contents gently shifting in the wind like laundry. But for every clever method, there is a gamble. Some lords tried preserving meat in fat, pouring rendered lard over cooked cuts and sealing them in crocks. It worked, unless a fly laid eggs beneath the lid. More fringe, a 14th century herbalist swore by storing meat in honey, entombed in sweetness, safe from air. The result, allegedly, was tender and perfumed, or a wasp's paradise. And here's a debate that never seems to end. Historians still argue whether medieval air-drying techniques were as consistent as the records suggest. Some say hams aged beautifully in attic beams across Europe. Others suggest that unless you lived in the Alps or had access to clean airflow, you were just slowly poisoning yourself with mold. But medieval people were not ignorant. They knew the signs of danger. The green fuzz, the sour stink, the oily rainbow sheen on suspect meat. And they trusted their instincts. A cook might cut away half a slab of beef if the other half seemed honest. A monk might sniff, mutter a prayer, and serve it anyway. Because the truth is, without cold, preservation was not just chemistry. It was a relationship, with the air, with the seasons, with your own luck, and sometimes, with the root cellar under your feet. Step into the kitchen now, not the cozy, fire-lit fantasy, but the smoky, frantic heart of a medieval manor. Here, the war against time and rot continues not with storage, but with transformation. If you can't keep meat raw, you cook it again, and maybe one more time for good measure. A pot hangs over the hearth, bubbling thick with spices, herbs, and what might once have been mutton. A boy stirs slowly with a wooden paddle nearly his height. Meat is boiled not once, but often twice or thrice, stewed into submission, layered into pies, or minced into paste to be folded inside pastries. Texture is less of a concern than safety. And flavor, that is where the real magic begins. Enter vinegar, wine, and sour beer. Acids became culinary weapons in medieval kitchens, masking sourness and slowing decay. Tough cuts of meat were soaked in them, softened, tangy, and safer. Marinades, though no one called them that, often blended garlic, onion, herbs, and wine into a kind of flavorful moat around a questionable haunch of venison. Mainstream fact: many aristocratic households kept sour cellars stocked with vinegar barrels specifically for culinary purposes. These were not condiments, they were the difference between elegance and indigestion. And the sauce game was next level. Take green sauce, made from crushed parsley, sage, and vinegar, designed to revive overcooked poultry. Or galantine, a sauce thickened with breadcrumbs and stock, spiced with cloves or ginger, and poured over cold, sliced meats. Even the fanciest meat might be boiled on Monday and sauced into splendor on Friday. Now, a fringe tidbit. A 15th century banquet menu from Burgundy lists a dish called char de porc revertes, or green card of pork, where slices of reheated pork were arranged to look like a chariot and painted with spinach juice. Was it good? Historians can't say, but it looked expensive, and that mattered. The cook here is not just preserving meat, he is preserving honor. The lord of the manor must never seem poor, never serve spoiled fare, never reveal the pantry's imperfections. So dishes are disguised. Meat is shredded and pressed into shapes. Sauces are tinted with saffron, cinnamon, or even ground almond, flavors so bold they bury yesterday's sins. Historians still argue whether these elaborate Recipes were designed for taste or performance. Some say they reflect true culinary genius, others believe they were simply desperate cover-ups, sugar-coated camouflage for sour lamb and borderline pigeon. But no matter the motive, the result is dazzling. On the great table, you might see a stuffed peacock redressed in its own feathers, its meat boiled, sauced, and sewn shut. A venison pie with a crust so thick it could stop a sword. Or a roast piglet, still smiling, hiding its briny aftertaste behind a smear of mustard and honey. This is survival by spectacle. Transformation as preservation. The kitchen does not just cook. It reinvents, rebrands, and sometimes, redeems. Because in the end, it is not just about whether the meat keeps. It is about whether you can make people forget how close it came to turning. Outside the manor, smoke curls from stone chimneys. But listen closely and you will hear something more urgent: axes, hooves, and the lowing of animals. It is slaughter season. Preserving meat in the Middle Ages is not just a kitchen concern. It is a calendar event, a community ritual, and a logistical nightmare managed with surprising precision. You do not just butcher animals when you feel like it. You wait for cold weather, short days, and the first frost to promise a natural chill. In villages across Europe, the annual slaughter is called Martinmas, named after Saint Martin of Tours and falling around November 11th. It marks the point when grazing ends, hay runs thin, and mouths must be fed another way. Pigs are led squealing to the block. Oxen that can no longer plow are thanked, then dispatched. Chickens go quietly. Mostly. It is not a bloody frenzy, though blood is everywhere. It is more like theater. Each person has a part. The butcher, of course. The scalders with steaming water to loosen bristles. The salters. The tripe cleaners. Even the children carry buckets or sing songs to distract. Mainstream historical fact: in many rural communities, the November slaughter was the only time large quantities of meat were consumed or preserved for the whole year. The event was as important as planting or harvest, arguably more so, because hunger does not wait for spring. And it is not just about the meat. Everything gets used. The blood becomes pudding. The fat is rendered for candles or cooking. Stomachs get washed, stuffed, and dried. Bones are split for marrow. Even the bladder might be inflated and given to children as a toy. Medieval frugality is not quaint. It is oxygen. What happens next is a preservation relay. The fresh cuts go to the salting tubs, thick with coarse crystals hauled from inland salt mines or coastal salt pans. It takes pounds of salt, more than you would guess. Cured meat might soak for weeks, turned daily, until the brine seeps into the core. Then it is hung, smoked, packed in barrels, or slathered in lard and hidden in cool nooks. And here's a quirky tidbit. In some German towns, families marked their salted meat barrels with carved wooden icons, tiny pigs, cows, or family crests, so they could reclaim their share from communal smokehouses. Because yes, some towns shared fire pits or curing rooms, turning preservation into a collective act. Historians still argue whether these shared labor systems were born of efficiency, necessity, or social control. Was it mutual aid, or a way for local lords to count pigs and enforce taxes? The answer's likely a bit of both. But one thing is clear: winter survival was not a solo endeavor. Whether lord or peasant, you relied on hands, your own, your neighbors, and the weather's. One unexpected thaw could spoil half a year's meat. One late frost could delay the kill too long. And yet, they adapted. Recipes evolved. Drying racks were moved higher. Cellars were dug deeper. A failed batch became stew. A spoiled cut became sausage. Meat was life, but it was also uncertainty. So you planned, prayed, salted, and hoped the pig would last till spring. Because in this world, you did not preserve meat. You preserved time. A chance to see May with a full belly and a clean bone in the fire. Not every plan works. Not every ham survives. For all the rituals, recipes, and hard-won knowledge, sometimes meat still spoils. And when it does, it is memorable. Let us wander back to a noble feast gone wrong. A grand hall packed with lords, music echoing off the stone walls, goblets lifted for the arrival of the centerpiece. A glazed boar's head, bristled and steaming. But as the carving knife slices in, a foul scent slips free, just a whisper at first, then an avalanche. One guest faints, another clutches their stomach. The steward quickly orders the boar removed, and dessert arrives suspiciously early. Later, the cook is missing, or promoted. Historians are not sure. For every triumph of preservation, there is a tale of failure. Meat wrapped too tightly, salt rubbed too thin, a warm winter, a leaky roof. It does not take much. Mainstream fact: many medieval cookbooks include recipes for salvaging partially spoiled meat, soaking it in vinegar or milk, reboiling it, or hiding it in heavily spiced sauces. These were not gourmet tricks. They were battlefield triage. And then there are the myths. Stories passed between hearths about sausages that never spoiled. Pigs preserved so perfectly they glowed. In one record, a monastery claims to have kept an entire ham for 7 years, slicing from it ceremonially each Easter. A miracle, or a well-salted fib. One fringe tidbit: a 14th-century French nobleman is said to have experimented with storing meat inside hollowed-out beehives, hoping the bees buzzing would keep flies away. Results unknown, possibly tragic. But the point was not perfection, it was survival. And even disaster had its lessons. One town near the Baltic began burying meat in frozen peat after 3 straight years of moldy pork. Another built smokehouses with chimneys so tall, they doubled as watchtowers. Preservation became not just a necessity, but a kind of regional identity. Your method said who you were, how your people had adapted to the land, the weather, the salt routes, the trade winds. Historians still argue whether meat preservation in the Middle Ages was more influenced by climate, commerce, or culture. Was a ham from Yorkshire salted differently than one from Provence because of temperature, or taste? Was the smoked trout of the Alps a culinary tradition or simply what the valley allowed? And what about the poor? What did they preserve, if anything at all? Some records suggest peasant families sun-dried meat, or smoked it over the hearth alongside laundry. Others hint at shared curing pits guarded by community elders. Still others imply they simply could not afford enough meat at once to need preserving. But in the end, preserved or not, meat carried meaning. It was a symbol of power, of planning, of feast over famine. Whether hoarded in barrels, spiced into disguise, or shared across a village, it connected people across seasons and classes. And so, as the last candle burns low in the hall, a lone kitchen boy scrapes the bones into a pot for tomorrow's broth. The feast is over, but the preservation continues. A marrow bone boiled twice more, a rind of bacon salted again, a stew whispered into existence from what was nearly lost. Because meat in the Middle Ages is not just food, it is memory, strategy, and stubborn hope. The fire fades, the bones are gone, and in the quiet after the feast, what remains is the echo of patience, smoke drifting through rafters, salt biting into skin, hands working in rhythm with seasons older than kings. Preserving meat was not elegant, it was not easy, but it was everything. A slow rebellion against hunger, waged one slab at a time. So if you ever complain about your freezer humming in the background, remember the pit, the cellar, the smokehouse, the salt. Remember the hands that made winter bearable. And above all, remember, food is never just food, especially when it is trying to survive.